What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and just yesterday, 14th of June, 2021, Warhammer community announced that Games Workshop was getting back into the competitive tournament scene. This is actually enormous news, and I'm so excited to cover it. Today, we're going to be talking about this article, the announcement of the US Open competitive Warhammer series for both 40k and Age of Sigmar, and we're going to go over some of the Warhammer 40k competitive rules that Games Workshop has posted following this announcement. So first off, the US Open circuit, I guess, is going to be made up of 3 events, one in Orlando, one in New Orleans, Louisiana, one in Austin, Texas. These are, I think, locations selected because they're hotbeds of competitive Warhammer play. I know Texas and Florida obviously both have some very dedicated communities, and a lot of really strong players come out of there. Now, I imagine that the reason that Games Workshop has elected to run these events off of the coasts is that they're going to be continuing to work with Frontline Gaming, who runs both the Las Vegas Open in Las Vegas and the Atlantic City Open that we just saw this past weekend over in New Jersey. So that gives pretty good coverage for these sort of large, super major style competitive events across the entirety of the country. Now, what's going to be super interesting to see is how these events get integrated into the existing competitive community. Are they going to be ITC ranked? I don't know. Who knows? That's going to be a great question. I'm sure that's something we'll find out in the not too distant future. Also, whether or not we're going to see these style of events elsewhere in the world, I think it would be cool to see these competitive circuits start popping up in Europe and Australia, some of the other places in the world where Warhammer events happen pretty consistently. They talk about the ticket options available for each event. You can buy a standard ticket, which gets you your event entry, or a premier ticket, which they talk about having an overall value well over $450. Comes with exclusive miniatures, including this cool Necron Lord guy, who's actually pretty sweet, as well as this Warrior of Chaos for Age of Sigmar. They talk about it also coming with an amazing Warhammer role-playing game. I imagine that maybe they have some, Warhammer Wrath or Glory, whatever the Warhammer books are called left over, and they're going to throw some of those in there. I also like they include the Citadel case. I don't know if they sell that many of those. But otherwise, you do get the dice tray, event-exclusive shirts, stuff like that. It all sounds pretty good, pretty standard premier ticket stuff. The dates and the venues are also discussed in this article. We have the Warhammer Open Orlando on the 13th through 15th of August, 2021. So that's coming up just shortly in a couple months here. We then have that followed up in October by New Orleans, as well as Austin in November. So almost back to back, we're going to have these 3 tournaments, but it's not exactly a circuit. It's just 3 individual tournaments that I guess come with cool prizes and clout if you win them, but they do talk about them being 256 player caps, so they are that super major level event that we talk about a lot in the 40k scene. Now, like I said before, I don't know whether these will be ITC ranked. I imagine that they will not be, but I could see it happening. Who knows? But that does mean that this may create kind of a second class of Warhammer tournament, ones that are sanctioned by the company themselves and who are probably going to be able to throw a lot of resources behind them, but on the flip side, maybe don't have the same global reach that the ITC rankings do from Frontline Gaming. So how that develops, we'll have to see. We're still early days yet, but I am excited to see that Games Workshop is diving back into competitive play. They are kind of accepting the competitive community. Now, this actually is coming off of a job posting that Games Workshop posted a couple of weeks ago, looking for an NA event organizer. And the job description they posted actually related very heavily to competitive play. So they talk about interfacing specifically with event judges, and they talk about requiring experience with tournament philosophy and concepts. So it makes sense to me that they would be expanding their organized play team in order to start running these events a little bit more commonly. I was really interested when I saw that job posting. It looked very much like Games Workshop was going to be trying to focus a little bit more on competitive play, just looking at that from the outside. But now that we have this announcement out, everything has been made clear. And speaking of making things clear, let's make clear the rules of the event, because we're going to talk about the event packet next, because there's some very interesting things that this has to tell us. So here we are with the Warhammer 40,000 Grand Tournament Series. Now, what's most interesting to me about this is that we're finally getting some I don't know about confirmation, but at least some communication from the company itself about how they would like to see competitive play organized. So far, especially when talking about things like pairing systems and terrain rules, Games Workshop has been totally silent. And we've just kind of been stumbling around using the suggestions in the core rulebooks, and the community has been kind of formulating our own terrain placement systems as the game goes on. We do have some very simple event essentials at the start here, how check-in and all of the schedules work, as well as some of the basic game information, obviously battle size, board size. Chapter Approved 2021 is going to be in use. 8 games being played over the course of the 3 days, and army selection rules as well as tools required. Now, interestingly, Games Workshop has left things a little bit open-ended on their army construction rules. This is just the format that you have to submit your army in, and they require that army lists need to be presented in an easy-to-read format, and they give an example of that as the Warhammer 40,000 app. The downside is that a lot of people don't use the app. It costs a bunch of money. It costs $5 a month, plus you have to still buy the hard copies of the codex to unlock them in the app, which gets pretty excessive. But also, it's full of bugs and has a ton of typos in the army builder itself. I think they're slowly correcting those, but as new codexes come out, those get kind of reintroduced. So, for the most part, the community uses Battlescribe, I think, for a lot of list building, and there's a couple other list building tools out there on the internet, and I want to applaud Games Workshop for accepting those army formats for these events. It could have been very easy for them to say, you have to use the app to build your list, you have to pay us a $5 subscription, otherwise you can't play in the tournament, but they will allow players to use those alternate formats, those third-party formats. Now, some stuff gets really interesting when we move to the army construction and painting rules, because Games Workshop being Games Workshop, I don't think it's surprising to anyone that they have some very strict modeling and painting guidelines. First off, they require kind of battle-ready painting. This is already essentially in the competitive system, since if you don't have a army painted to this standard, then you lose 10 points every time you play, which makes it very difficult to actually win all your games over the course of a tournament. And I appreciate that they give you some images here of the standard that should be met, the sort of minimum standard. We have contrast paints, as well as standard paints, which is just a single flat color on all of the different surfaces of the model. And we can see here, like, this Primaris Reaver is painted almost to a 3-color standard. It's like a 4-color standard, right? You have the blue, you have the black, you have the gold, and then you have some silver accents and stuff like that. So realistically, this should not be a difficult standard for people to get to. And most players are already there when we're talking about the competitive community, since people don't want to be losing those 10 points in tournaments. They do have rules on converted models or units. They talk specifically about Forge World models that we'll talk about momentarily. Basically, they say that you cannot model for advantage. Basically, you're going to be interposing the correctly assembled, Citadel miniature sculpt if you're ever measuring for range or line of sight or something like that. So if you have built a model to be smaller, that doesn't get you any benefit. You could save this entire paragraph by just writing actual line of sight rules for your game, Games Workshop, but you know what? That's not what we're here to talk about. They require any converted models to be approved before the event, which makes total sense. And they also state that they appreciate that some models may be no longer represented in the current model range and will be required to be converted. However, there is a note at the bottom of the paragraph here that says any Forge World models must be the actual models from Forge World. Conversions that look like Forge World models will not be allowed. This does create a little bit of a problem, given that Forge World models tend to be extremely hard to acquire. Forge World has a very low rate of production. It's a kind of boutique shop, and for that reason, they are constantly out of stock, especially if a unit gets buffed or is particularly meta at the time. They can sell out extremely quickly, and that model, at least through Forge World and not through third parties, becomes impossible to acquire. So that is a potential problem I can see to the sort of the competitiveness of the event, but it does dissuade people from bringing those Forge World models if they aren't assured that they can get their hands on them. Given that Forge World models, given that a lot of Forge World units are essentially one conversion away from being a plastic unit, especially looking at a lot of the Space Marine stuff, I understand why they would want to be pushing the sale of those actual Forge World models. And, in addition, obviously, those models are upcharged in excess of what a standard plastic kit would be for a similar unit. So, GW wants to move those, and good on them. I'm just worried that there may be some situations where lists could be predicated on Forge World units that get sold out very quickly, and you cannot get them at least directly through the company itself, which could be problematic. Before we move on from the modeling rules over to the painting rules in this document, I do want to point out one section on the previous page, which is what you see is what you get rules. The good old WYSIWYG clause. Basically, this document specifies that all of your models have to accurately represent what the entry is on your army roster. They give the example of a Space Marine equipped with a meltagun. If it has a meltagun, you must have the meltagun bit on that model. However, there is a second clause here. They give the example in this instance of frag grenades being, added to a tactical squad. So, rules as written per that first sentence, because if your tactical squad with the meltagun guy in it all are equipped with frag grenades and bolt pistols, you would have to glue bolt pistols and frag grenades onto every single one of your models to prevent being ejected from the event via judge. This is a sort of a ludicrous standard since no one ever is going to look that hard at a model, and because all of the unit is equipped identically, each of those models is going to have that piece of war gear. So they've included this last sentence here saying that equipment such as frag grenades that we just talked about, that are included on every model in a unit need not be modeled. So obviously the intention of this rule is that, for example, if you have a non-upgrade piece of war gear, your entire unit has pistols and you don't want to glue the little pistol bit to every single one of them, you don't have to. The downside is when you extrapolate that out. For example, if you took that same tactical squad, but you did not include the meltagun guy, every model in the unit would be equipped with probably a bolt gun, bolt pistol, and frag grenades, which mean that because they're all equipped identically, per this rule, you no longer have to include any of that war gear on those models. You could just, basically take tactical marine bodies with no arms on them and put them down and be like, these are my tactical marines, they're all the same. So that's a problem. When you extrapolate it further, what happens if you have a single model unit with this? Those models are always going to be equipped identically, so things like tanks, monsters, characters, all of those, per this rule, do not have to have any of their war gear modeled. So you could theoretically, bring a Space Marine captain with no weapons and no backpack and tell your opponent that he's a jump pack captain with a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, and that's perfectly legal per this clause. This is a really big downside of kind of the nebulous gray area of modeling rules. And while I definitely understand the intention behind the rule, it could be implemented a little bit better. And so this is an issue. This is something that should probably be addressed before modeling approval begins to go out for these events. Now, the part that gets me going a little bit, not in a great way though, is that there are paint scheme requirements. Now, all of these requirements are subject to permission. These aren't hard and fast rules, but these are things that you'll have to get in touch with the event organizers beforehand. First off, if you are using rules for an army that are different from the color scheme in which they are painted, you have to submit the army for approval. So this is, for example, if you are playing a White Scars army, but your armor's painted blue, so you look like Ultramarines, you would have to have that approved by the event organizers beforehand. Now, these style rules, especially for Warhammer 40k, which is a game heavily influenced by its kind of rich lore, always confused me, because Games Workshop and Warhammer 40k in general is heavily incentivized to have players paint their models in a way that is lore friendly. The downside is that then assigning rules to that paint scheme means that there is an actual downside to painting your models canonically. So, for example, if I were to paint my models as Ultramarines and go to a Warhammer 40k event, I probably could not run them as White Scars. But if I had just painted my models a bright blue with no iconography on them and no distinguishing characteristics, because that color scheme has no canonical lore association with any mechanics in the game, I can play it as whatever I want. So there is literally a competitive benefit to painting my models not what Games Workshop wants you to paint them. And that is bad. I think a lot of people would much rather see, cool-looking Ultramarines on the table, regardless of whether or not they are literally using the Ultramarines mechanic. As long as somebody likes Ultramarines and they want to play with their Ultramarines models, let them frickin' do that. As long as it's been clearly communicated to their opponent what the capabilities of their models are, which is why we make army lists and give them to our opponent before the game, then it's not an issue. Warhammer 40k players are generally smart people. We're not going to get confused that someone's biker is painted blue rather than white and therefore not know what their stuff does. That's silly. Now, in addition, we also have another requirement, and I like that they specifically call out Tyranids here because I think they're the worst offender for this. As a Tyranid player, That's definitely the case. But if you have multiple sub-factions in your army and any of them are deviate from the official color scheme, you have to submit the army for approval. Now, my Tyranid army is all painted as one color scheme, and I typically use rubber bands, or sometimes I paint some accents on the models to differentiate them between the High Fleet detachments that I use. Obviously, playing Tyranids, this is why this example is so funny, is that you almost always start with a High Fleet Kronos detachment because that's the most effective shooting sub-faction. But then you also add in a more melee-oriented sub-faction elsewhere in the list. And I don't think I know a single Tyranid player who's actually painted the two detachments differently. The downside of that is, like we talked about before, if you use the official color schemes, then you're locked into using those mechanics if you play in an event with this style of rule. But then also, your army doesn't look that good. Cohesive armies tend to look much better. I understand the impetus behind this rule, because what you want to do is make it clear to your opponent which models are in which sub-factions if you're breaking your army into multiple sub-factions. That's not really an issue that, for example, Space Marines have, because Space Marines are highly disincentivized from taking multiple sub-factions in a single army, whereas a lot of other factions very much are. You know, I'm looking at Tyranids, I'm looking at Drukhari, I'm looking at Tau even. And if you're looking at just a gaggle of battle suits and you don't know exactly which one is in which sub-faction just by looking at them, that can be confusing on the table. So I absolutely understand the requirement for a rule like this. I am worried that it may be over-enforced. Previously, ITC events just had a rule that said essentially you had to have an obvious indicator that indicated your models were in different sub-factions, and I think a rule like that is much more appropriate. But we'll see exactly the level to which the event organizers are looking to hold players to this standard. If they're looking for an entirely different color scheme between different sub-factions, that's, I think, a much different thing than looking for players to just, paint a different icon on their shoulder pad. I would love to see some photos of what's acceptable and what's not, just like they did for the battle ready painting rules. I think that would help kind of elucidate what they're looking for. It's probably not a huge deal, but I don't like the association between the color scheme that you choose to paint your models and their impact on the table. A miniature game is about complete player expression, and as soon as you are taking a component of that expression, that being the painting of your models, and restricting it based on the mechanics of those models on the tabletop, I think that is a bad thing. They talk about their judge policy as well, which is all pretty standard stuff. Every judge individually has final say on game rules and any tournament issues. This is kind of a boilerplate rule that most competitive circuits have, or competitive systems have, just so that there's no second guessing of judges and you can just continue on depending on what the judge says. Even if the judge is actually wrong in that case, having them be the final arbiter of how a thing is going to be played at that moment just makes the entire event run more smoothly. They also have a clause here that says that any ruling will be based on rules interpretations rather than adhering to previous precedents, and individual rulings are never a binding precedent. I think that this could create some awkward experiences if you have several judges at the event. And for example, maybe you have a list that's based on a particular interaction. Your opponent calls a judge on your interaction, and one judge may say that it's fine, and the other judge may have a separate interpretation of that rule. But I don't think that that's a really huge issue. And I do appreciate that what they don't want to do is have one judge rule incorrectly, like at one of these events, and then have the next event in the circuit be bound by what that one judge said that one time. So this gives them the leeway to change their minds if they ever need to. They also have a player conduct section that basically says, don't be a dick. If you cheat, lie to judges, pick up your dice too quickly, or engage in any other form of unethical or inappropriate conduct, you can be subject to penalties based on the judgment of the judge at the time. They also note here that even accidental errors will be punished, which I think is totally fair. This is a competitive event after all, and I do love this sentence: we treat them as penalties akin to those which occur during a sporting event. Which to me sounds very funny, because it sounds to me like the author of this document assumed that the average 40k player reading this didn't know what a penalty was, which is like, you've watched football, what happens with them. It's like the same thing. We understand the concept that someone behaving inappropriately or cheating during a game is going to be punished. We get it. It's okay, GW. We're not that dumb. They talk about how judges will be actively judging over the course of the event, meaning that if they see something that's being resolved incorrectly, they will step in to at least elucidate the situation rather than only being able to intervene when a player calls them in. They have basically a 2-paragraph essay that they wrote about why people shouldn't be upset when they lose, which seems a little bit condescending. Concessions are discouraged, but are allowed. A judge will have to calculate the final score for you if that happens. Now, moving on, they talk about the tournament format, including the actual game format. They have a policy that once scores are submitted, they're set in stone and cannot be changed. I do kind of like this. There have been instances, kind of high-profile instances in the past, of players in events realizing that a game was scored incorrectly after the fact and having it changed and then having to repair players and it being a nightmare to resolve. And I kind of like the idea that, once you're done, and you should have caught it at the table if there was an issue or called a judge if you had a question about it, which, I think is totally fine. They also talk about the event schedule. Now, interestingly, the rounds for each of these games are 3 hours. That does include all of the pre-game setup. They are using a milestone format to keep games on time. I think the big downside of this is that there are no chess clocks being used in these events. And while I don't know that chess clocks are really necessary for most Warhammer 40k games, I think having the opportunity to allow players to use a chess clock is very appropriate. And I don't see any rules allowing for that in here. But basically, you have 3 hours to complete your game, and they have these specific milestones. Now, 3 hours is plenty of time to finish a game of Warhammer 40k, so I kind of doubt that you would require a chess clock with that amount of time. 9th edition 40k plays kind of obscenely fast. And then the in-person events that I've played in so far, around 150 minutes per round, so that being about 2.5 hours is more than enough time to complete your games. If you wanted to push players, I think you could complete an entire round of 40k under 2 hours, but that would probably require some practice ahead of time, as well as the implementation of chess clocks and some leeway in setting up and breaking down the game. If you're playing orcs, maybe not. Orcs take a long time. Some Space Marine lists take a long time, so it's certainly not the case for everybody, but definitely you should be able to complete your game in 3 hours, no problem. They talk about the per player breakdown, which I think if you are playing at home is a pretty good rule of thumb to set yourself to. You should take no more than 10 minutes to deploy your whole army. You should play your first turn in no more than 20 minutes, your second turn in no more than 20 minutes. Or if you need to, and your army plays maybe relatively slow in the early game, you can play your first couple rounds in 10 minutes and then take 20 minutes on third or fourth turns, depending on when the actual engagement happens. But generally speaking, none of your turns in a game of 9th edition 40k should be longer than 20 minutes. And if they are, you should probably do some practice to speed yourself up to get in on under that clock. Lastly, they talk about the awards available to participants. You can win Best Painter, highest victory points regardless of record. So that is something that's cool. If you lose a game, but you still score highly in that game, you can try to push for big points later on. I love these kind of achievement style prizes, because even if you lose a game early and you're not in contention to win the event overall anymore, you can still compete for something. And I think these are very appropriate. A lot of the competitive formats that I've put together for other games in the past usually have a lot of these style kind of sub-objectives that you can fight for even if you're not in contention for number one. Then you can also win a prize for semi-finalist as well as bracket champion. This is described a little bit on the next page. The tournament is divided into brackets as it goes on, and if you are a victor in your bracket, then you are eligible for another prize. So next up, it talks about pairings. It uses a win path pairing system. So you get paired with players that have the same record and who won or lost at the same time. So that's probably a pretty good indicator of people who are on the same skill level, because you will lose as the undefeated pool shrinks to the same size. So generally speaking, you're going to be losing against people of a similar skill level. Because the event is 8 rounds, after round 4, every player gets split into brackets of 16 players based on your current record. So essentially, they'll rank everyone based on win-loss and then group everyone who is on a similar record. Then you'll go on to play the remaining 4 rounds of the tournament, essentially each one of them being like a little tiny RTT. And it means that the next 4 rounds you play against will always be against people who are around the same skill level. Since you will already have been ranked around the same point after round 4. They also talk about how this is to avoid submarining, so if you bring a weaker list, you could lose a couple of the first round games, so you get easier opponents for the rest of the day, and then use that to push your overall score. This does look like a system that will create a lot of more fun experiences in the later rounds. And obviously, each of those brackets has one of those bracket champion prizes up for grabs. So if you are able to win your final 4 games against people who are theoretically around the same skill level as you, it's like winning a little RTT by yourself. They do talk about how rounds 7 and 8 on the Sunday are optional. So if you do lose a couple of your games, you are totally within your rights to drop. The final 2 rounds is essentially the top cut, where the top 4 players in the number 1 bracket will be fighting for best overall. If you're also looking to score a prize like the highest victory points or the winner of your bracket, obviously you would have to stay in all 8 games, but they don't require it, which I think is pretty appropriate. They also have a little bit of a designer's note in here about the intentions of this system, and I do want to say it definitely looks like a fun event to play in, because you are guaranteed to be playing against people of a similar skill level to you, and it does make your final 4 rounds sort of a tournament of their own. Your first 4 rounds are just to place you in that tournament, and then you can try to fight for your place out of those 16 people, which I think is kind of interesting. Now, Nova Open used the same format, which makes a ton of sense because Mike Brandt is the organizer of the Nova Open and also designing these rules as well. The downside of this system being used at the Nova Open is that because it was ITC scored, fighting for the highest placement you could get, so you got the most standings points, was a big deal. So playing out all 8 games in order to try to push your score as high as possible was the way to squeeze as many standings points out of that event as you could get. And unfortunately, because it used this 16-player bracket system, you actually could no longer progress past those 16 players once you were seated in them after round 4. And this is actually sort of incredibly demoralizing. You were stuck within those 16 players, and while there were prizes for winning all your games once the brackets got locked in, like I said before, I don't know if these events are going to be ITC scored. I have a sneaking suspicion that they will not be, and with that in mind, I think this bracket system works a lot better than it would in an ITC event, where fighting for your final placement is very important. The big difference between this and the Nova Open as well is that the Nova Open is its own convention, and while it was being run, there were hundreds of other events happening around you, just around the Warhammer 40k Major. There were demos being run, there were vendors there, and there's a lot of other things to do at that event, whereas these events seem, very specifically tuned to be, Warhammer 40k tournaments, and that's it. So dropping out early, so if you drop out early in this event, there's not much else to do. So I think there will be a lot less impetus to drop once you have been locked into those brackets. Whereas at Nova, because you couldn't progress your score and there were other things going on, there was almost no reason to keep playing if your first 4 rounds didn't go very well. Now, lastly, GW has really saved the best for last with this, because we have the terrain layout rules for this event, and this is the first indicator of how Games Workshop and their rules team and their tournament organizers are viewing competitive terrain setups in 9th edition Warhammer 40k, which is not something that we have seen before. So this is actually a really huge deal. And I imagine that a lot of tournaments are going to be moving towards setups that mirror these so that they can be closer to the format of the US Open, or the, Warhammer Open tournament system. There are 2 terrain layouts, and they may be switched around from game to game, and that's it, basically. Each terrain layout has 3 types of terrain. They just give you them based on colors. The big, huge rectangles here are terrain piece number 1. These are big ruins. They're scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible, obscuring, so these are just big buildings, essentially. The little tiny maroon boxes are the terrain piece number 2, which are smaller ruins. These, I think, are maybe about 8 to 10 inches long, maybe 6 inches wide. Also have the same terrain keyword: scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible, obscuring. And then last but certainly not least, we have these little patches in the back here. These are probably little 6x6 area terrain pieces. These are scalable, dense cover, breachable, defensible, difficult ground. So these are basically exactly forests. Some interesting things to note about this: no obstacle terrain included whatsoever. Now, first off, there's no low obstacles like defense lines or Promethean pipes or those things that GW likes to put in all of their... I think we actually saw some of those earlier on in the packet. Yeah, here they are, like these little things. People like putting these down and saying that, we've included the correct amount of terrain because that Games Workshop recommends, which is 1 piece per a 12 inch by 12 inch square, generally speaking. But these basically don't do anything on the tabletop. These are tactically useless, and they're mostly there for window dressing. The interesting thing to me is that other obstacle style terrain has not been included. So that's things like Munitorum crates, shipping containers, big rocks. That kind of stuff sees play a lot. Games Workshop loves to put those little crates down all over the place. And it's curious to me that no type of terrain like that has been included. Now, they also note that these layouts are going to be pretty general, it looks like. These big, huge boxes, I don't believe are going to be the actual size of the terrain. I imagine that there are some lines in here which are representing the ruined walls. I imagine that that's actually going to be kind of the size of the terrain feature. So we're probably looking at something like this. This is just going to be maybe the base of the terrain, or maybe just a general area in which the terrain will be placed. So I don't think that we can take this, as standard, that these will be like 12 inch by 12 inch giant bricks of obscuring terrain. I think they're going to be a little bit more nuanced than that. And they do mention that to provide players with a varied experience throughout the event. Now, they also talk about how these layouts are going to be influenced by the deployment zone of the mission being played, which makes a ton of sense to me. I imagine that we see this style of table for a short table edge or diagonal deployment zone. So you can imagine that like a hammer and anvil style deployment zone, to use the old 8th edition terminology, will give you some good coverage behind these buildings, but then you'll also be able to kind of chain together the obscuring from this building as well as this small building, so that you have a very concentrated corner in which your opponent doesn't have really good lines of sight. And even for a diagonal deployment zone, like a priority targets or a vital intelligence, you can see that there are good lines of sight being blocked behind these ruins, and especially once you combine the effect of these large buildings in here with the smaller ones in your deployment zone. This one feels a little bit more appropriate for a long table edge deployment. If you do a long table edge deployment on this first layout, you have these lines of fire that shoot basically directly across the table, and it's going to be very difficult to hide yourself appropriately. Whereas if you're to play a long table edge deployment zone on this one, the combination of these big ruins plus the two smaller ruins in the center block line of sight to the majority of your deployment zone. You could potentially move around here and get decent lines of fire into each deployment zone, but moving through the center and getting lines of sight to everything's a little bit harder. Now, they do talk about how they're going to be releasing some articles about exactly how these layouts are going to be working. Those are just my theories, but we'll see the thoughts of the actual design team. But what's exciting about this announcement is that, we finally have, a pseudo-official terrain layout for competitive 40k, and that's what we can work with going forward. I know WTC already uses its own terrain system, and they do a great job of keeping balanced terrain, but as GW gets more and more involved in competitive play, I imagine that we see a lot of communities moving towards this style of layout. And it may be the direction of the future. We may see these terrain layouts a little more standardized. I would love to see maybe even terrain kits come out from Games Workshop, where you can just buy a tournament, table worth of terrain in one box. I think that would be great. And this has been something that 40k has been needing for a while. The community's just kind of been lost as to how to approach competitive terrain placement, and while there's a lot of tribal knowledge we've been able to generate over our experience with the game, getting it directly from the horse's mouth, as it were, getting directly from the Games Workshop design team, I think helps a lot. I'm actually really hype about the fact that GW is kind of finally jumping into releasing these more competitive rules. I am hype that they finally have, what is essentially a tournament packet. It is only for a couple of events, but we can adopt this for use in RTTs if we really want to, and we want to mirror with this win path pairing. And I hope that overall the community becomes more standardized. But anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about today. Really wanted to touch on the pretty momentous announcement that Games Workshop will be running their uncompetitive events in 2021. Excited to see the future of where this circuit goes in 2022. Given that Games Workshop basically only has 6 months to play all 3 of these events through, I wonder if we see a little bit more of a fleshed out series in 2022, maybe with the events culminating in, a big finals event at the end of the year or something like that. And whether or not this integrates into the existing competitive format that the 40k community already has is a really big deal. So huge announcements coming out of Games Workshop just this week, and I'm so excited to see the future of the game. As always, thanks for watching to the end of the video. Big thanks to all my patrons over at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All those people are phenomenal, and they keep me doing what I do. And as we get prepared for some Games Workshop sanctioned competitive play. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.